Today we're going to be talking about Roch Theriault and the Anthill Kids cult. This includes discussion of extreme violence, brainwashing, and abuse. If this is too upsetting for you, now is your chance to stop listening. On October 6th, 1989, at a compound in the woods of rural Ontario, Canada, Roch Theriault was arrested. He was calm, collected. He even instructed the other members of his cult not to fight back, not to resist. All the while, he was wearing the rib bone of his wife around his neck like a totemic talisman. The years leading up to this were rife with unbelievable and mind-shattering abuse. Even still, even with him in police custody, many of his people refused to leave him, including several of his other wives. This is what happened. Roch Theriault, who would later often go by Roch, was born in 1947 in Quebec, Canada. He was praised for his intelligence as a young man, but he dropped out of school in his 7th grade. It's unclear if this was because of a lack of home care or a problem with authority. Roch would later claim that he was severely abused by his own father, but these accounts are disputed both by his father and everyone else who knew him at that point in his life. It's difficult to say for sure whether or not that actually happened. While an average person is unlikely to lie about such abuse, Roch would prove to be far from average. His parents were Christian and active in the church. As he grew up, he himself became obsessed with the Book of Revelations, the Christian prophecy of doomsday and the end times. He stayed active and committed to church life as he grew into a troubled teenager. Perhaps too much so. In a telling sign of what would come later in life, he was actually kicked out of his church for trying to assume too much power. Throughout his teen years, he underwent multiple operations to remove ulcers from his stomach that were causing him severe pain. As a result of these many operations, he was diagnosed with what's called dumping syndrome, a condition that meant he did not process food properly. It could have a myriad of serious symptoms, and it would affect him for the rest of his life. But it also spurred a sudden interest and obsession with human anatomy and surgery. He took to reading textbooks on the subject as a matter of interest. In his late teens, he married his first wife, Francine Grenier, and moved to Montreal, where he worked with the fire department. Roch also started approaching people in bars to talk to them about faith and God. He was apparently very charismatic and charming, a talker. But he was also a liar. He would make up stories about himself, and even talk about miracles performed either by him or for him, that of course never really occurred. Eventually, he quit his job in the city and moved back near his family. He became a carpenter instead, but his interest in religion, spirituality, and the acquisition of personal power remained. He would ask his parents for permission to start a nudist colony on their property. They politely declined. Roch was 30 in 1977 when a group of Seventh-day Adventists set up shop near his home in Thetford Mines. They preached about the future of humanity, and Roch quickly took an interest in this. He latched onto their teachings in the same way he had become obsessed with other topics before. This time, it led him to quit drinking, quit smoking, and to become a vegetarian. By then, he had started seeing a woman named Giselle. He brought her into the church with him. Eventually, his wife left him over this, both because of his public infidelity and because he wasn't taking care of his children. While Roch was seemingly obsessed with his religion and was becoming worthy of his version of God, it did not stop his cheating on his wife, nor his premarital sex with Giselle. In fact, it was through the church that Roch met several of the young women who would go on to be his followers. It was on a retreat to the beautiful countryside of Quebec that he told his church that he had a vision from God, that they were in a holy place. Many of them believed him. It was with these followers that he rented a house and turned it into a clinic. It was meant to focus on helping people to stop smoking and to live a healthy lifestyle. It sounds like a noble goal. It also aligned with Roch's interests in the human body and mastery over it. And of course, his arrogance did not allow him to stop at simply trying to help people quit smoking. He met a local man and found out his wife was suffering from leukemia and was being treated for it by doctors. Roch convinced the man to transfer his wife into the care of his clinic, who would treat her leukemia with fruits, vegetables, a healthy diet, and a clean lifestyle. Apparently, doctors simply don't know the power of getting all of your vitamins. A month later, under his care, the woman died. This is what led the Adventist pastors to voting Roch out of the church, but Roch was unbothered. He retained his followers, who had run the clinic with him, and were thoroughly convinced of both his abilities as a healer and a man of God. The one thing that did worry Giselle, however, was how much time Roch was now spending with other young women. It worried her since she herself had, after all, been one of those young women. Giselle told Roch that he needed to marry her. He did. He also quickly impregnated her. But this was a time of uncertainty. Scared of the directions things were going in the church, in the clinic, a pregnant Giselle threatened to leave Roch. In response, he beat her severely and locked her away in a room in the clinic so that she couldn't flee. Giselle had no support, no safety net outside of the clinic, since at this point, Roch had already proclaimed that his followers break off ties with family, since they were bad influences and ungodly. This is a common tactic of both cults and abusers, forcing their victims away from their support networks so that they must rely entirely on the person abusing them. But now, having his supposed authority challenged by his wife and having her threaten to leave him, as well as having been kicked from the church itself, Roch became paranoid. He thought people were trying to take his power away from him, to rob him of what he viewed as his hard-earned and rightful position. He also had outstanding debts to several locals, and since the death of the woman he was treating for leukemia was being observed closely by the local police, he decided that it was time to move on, to further take his people into isolation and away from his mistakes. Roch proclaimed that God would return to Earth on February 17th, 1979, and that this return would naturally herald the end of the world as we know it, an apocalypse. He told his people that God appointed him as his personal emissary, and that anyone who was loyal to him would be saved from the impending disaster. And so on June 5th of 1978, he moved his group, then consisting of 6 men, 12 women, 2 kids, and himself, to the area around the mountains of St. Hugo. His followers, at his command, started building cabins for them all to stay in. Unable to help due to his stomach problems and his general aversion to work, he laid back on a hillside and watched them. They reminded him of worker ants, going about their tasks to benefit the queen ant. And thus, the anthill kids were born. When the cabin was finished, he rechristened all of his followers with new biblical names. He took on the name Moses for himself. It was also around this time that he started sleeping with all of the women in the group. It was, of course, God's will. This infuriated Giselle, who was pregnant once more, and she tried to run away from the cult. But Roch caught her and threatened to kill her. Now isolated in the woods and away from everyone she'd ever known except Roch and his followers, she had no choice but to give in and return to the cabin. As time passed, Roch worked his people hard. He kept them exhausted and at his beck and call all day, every day. This too is a common tactic for cults, to keep people too busy and too tired to think clearly. It makes them dependent on you. Eventually, They stopped questioning Roch's orders, and it just became how their daily lives were. It was taken for granted that you would listen to him, that you would get up in the morning and do as he said until he allowed you to sleep at night. In order to fund the group and make money, they started going to nearby towns to sell baked goods. A lot of the members also received welfare checks from the province of Quebec, and these checks all went directly into Roch's hands. In late 1978, however, the Jonestown Massacre occurred. While that does not have any direct tie to the Anthill Kids, it did refocus public attention on cults and on strange religious groups. The Canadian media turned their gaze to a strange man who lived in the woods with a bevy of college dropouts that he was sleeping with, to a charismatic but dangerous man who said God was coming back soon. He was taken into custody and underwent a series of psychological evaluations. It should be noted here that Roch agreed to this. He did not resist, and he was not formally arrested. This was all done with his consent. But, being a master manipulator, he convinced the psychologist that he was no harm to anyone, and he was returned to his camp. Shortly after that return, he held an official ceremony to make every woman in camp his wife. Eventually, February of 1979 arrived, and God did not. Roch simply said that he must have gotten the day wrong. To quote, "In the eyes of God, 1 second could be 40 of our years, just as 40 of his years may be 1 second to us. But God was still coming, and soon." To many outsiders, it's hard to imagine how people continued to follow Roch when he was very provably not the disciple of God. And you're not alone. One of Roch's followers and wives was a woman named Chantal Labrie. Her parents missed her, wanted her home, and their solution had been to simply wait. They thought that when God inevitably did not show up on the appointed day, Chantal would realize what Roch really was and walk away. But that is not how cults work. We can see this same mentality in any modern-day cult. Goalposts shift, and people either do not care, or they ignore it in favor of following the person that they have pledged themselves to. Sometimes there are elements of sunk cost fallacy at play, but other times it doesn't even occur to the person in question to doubt the words of their leader. And that's just what happened. Unsatisfied and in disbelief, Chantal's parents got a court order for a psychiatric evaluation on their daughter. Police arrived at the compound and said that they were there to take Chantal. But Roch would not give them permission to enter, Chantal would not come outside, and they didn't have the right to enter his property without permission. The police ended up leaving without her. Finally, on April 18th, the police returned, and this time, they arrested Roch for obstruction of justice. He was ordered into a 30-day psychiatric hold, and during that time, Chantal was taken for her evaluation. With Roch gone, the families of several cult members tried to get into the compound with the goal of luring their family members back home. Universally, they were unwilling to leave. 30 days later, Chantal was said to be in perfect mental health and was freed under her own power. She returned immediately to the compound. During this time, and during his own 30-day psychiatric hold, Roch was able to speak to the media. He showed them letters of support from his followers, talking about how they loved him and the many ways that he had helped them correct problems in their lives. As a result of how the media portrayed Roch, rather than helping to dismantle his cult, they made him into a sort of a folk hero, a religious man living in the woods and helping troubled youth, living a simple life that harkened back to easier times. His wards loved him, and he was being persecuted by the state. At least, that's how the media helped him to spin it. Of course, none of that was true. In fact, Roch was getting far worse. After returning from his stay with the government, he completely abandoned the healthy living he preached. He began drinking alcohol again, and heavily. While Roch was still technically accepting new members to his cult, it was during this period that he decided the best way to grow the group was to simply father new members himself. As time passed, he would go on to father over 20 children, with 12 different women. Physical abuse became an increasingly common punishment in the group, and Roch would escalate to violence for little or no reason at all. It started with him resorting to abusing and beating the children in the cult, but it didn't stop there. He said that God told him he needed to physically discipline his followers. He would punch them, or hit them with hammers. One member was even told that he needed to prove his loyalty by cutting one of his wife's toes off. When the man hesitated, Roch gave him an ultimatum. Either you cut one of your wife's toes off, or I'll cut them all off. The man did as he was told. In March of 1980, Roch's 2 sons from his first marriage came to visit the camp, and Roch had a large party to celebrate them. During the celebration, a man named Guy, who was not technically a full cult member, but more of an employee of Roch, was left to watch the other children. Guy claimed that 2-year-old Samuel would not stop crying, and so Guy picked him up by the throat and punched him in the face, 5 or 6 times. When Roch found out what had happened, he took the boy to the cult's nurse. According to her, the boy's face was bruised and swollen, but he was otherwise alright. Roch seemed to disagree. In a bizarre turn of events, he decided that 2-year-old Samuel needed to be circumcised to correct the beating. Where this idea came from and how it relates to the beating that Guy gave the child is unclear. More than likely, Roch just saw an excuse, a helpless victim, a reason to exercise his obsession with the human body, an excuse for a power trip. Roch sterilized a razor by soaking it in alcohol, and he made Samuel take a few drinks as well. Then he tried to perform the procedure himself. The next morning, Samuel was dead. It's unclear if the exact cause was the beating that Guy gave him, the unnecessary surgery that followed, or the fact that Roch brute-forced the boy into drinking medical-grade alcohol. They burned the body to hide the evidence. Roch held a sort of trial for Guy for having beaten Samuel so badly and blaming him for the death. It was a mockery of a real trial, and at the end of it, Roch declared that Guy needed to be castrated as punishment. Through abuse, manipulation, and raw terror, Roch convinced Guy that the castration would be good for him, and even got him to sign a contract agreeing to it. Roch performed the surgery himself. Unlike poor Samuel, Guy lived through it. Perversely, the fact that Guy lived seemed to upset Roch, who was now declared that simply castrating was not enough of a punishment. Even though many feel it was Roch force-feeding the 2-year-old medical alcohol that killed him, he blamed Guy. This turned Guy into Roch's favorite new whipping boy. He would leverage beatings and punishments on him randomly for any imagined transgression. He also repeatedly ordered other cult members to murder Guy, only to call them off at the last minute. He used this as a form of psychological torment, repeatedly convincing him that he was about to be killed. This caused such a raw and complete terror in the man that he fled the compound to a nearby town and confessed everything about Samuel's death. While the process was slower than anyone would like, this did spur an investigation. And finally, in December of 1981, police stormed the Anthill Kids' compound and arrested Roch, Samuel's parents, and several other cult members. They did locate Samuel's charred remains on the cult's property, and they delivered him to a coroner for autopsy. Despite the age of the remains and the burning, the coroner was able to determine that the death was not an accident, and ultimately, 7 different cult members, including Guy and Roch, were charged with involvement in it, one way or another. Roch himself was held without bail. While many of the other cult members made bail, the cult actually abandoned their compound during this time. They rented a house near the prison, so that they could be close to their leader and see him as often as possible. But the Canadian authorities were now actively fighting back. Because of Samuel's death, they removed 7 children from the cult. Their parents were told that they could either leave the group and regain their children, or all of them would go into the foster care system. Without Roch there as a daily presence, the parents capitulated. They got apartments separately from the cult and agreed to regular visits from child services. But now, of course, we know that's not how indoctrination works. Just because you physically step away from the cult does not mean that your brainwashing disappears. In 1982, the 7 members of the Anthill Kids that had been arrested were found guilty of various crimes. Roch was sentenced to 2 years in prison, plus 3 years probation for criminal negligence causing bodily harm. The only one involved who was not found guilty was Guy. This was due to reasons of mental illness. Guy was sentenced to a psychiatric facility in Quebec City instead. Authorities hoped that putting Roch behind bars for a few years would dissolve the cult. Of course, anyone could have told them that wouldn't be how it worked. In fact, Roch impregnated 3 more of his followers during his time in jail, thanks to conjugal visits. He kept in constant contact through phone calls, and any time a cult member seemed to be wavering, he would speak to them on the phone and bring them back to the path that God had supposedly set out for them. When Roch was finally released in 1984, he immediately set about trying to get the cult back to their camp. Surprisingly, it was a struggle, for several reasons. Years of living in the city had gotten his people used to niceties like running water, heat, security. They'd also have to start from scratch. While Roch was away, the authorities in Quebec seemingly declared the camp unfit to live in and unsafe, and they burned it down. Now obviously being watched by authorities, Roch wanted to get out from under the thumb of the Quebec government. He scouted a large plot of land in Ontario, a 200-acre farm in rough country. Though it would violate the probation of several cult members, including Roch himself, he made them all a promise. If they moved there with him, he would quit drinking, and there would be no more violence. It's actually hard to think of a more common set of lies and excuses for an abuser to use. But they believed him. It took 5 months for the Anthill Kids to set their new farm up with a 2-story house, a cabin, a sawmill, a root cellar, and a bakery. Unlike when they lived in Quebec, they were no longer receiving welfare money. It's not totally clear if this is because the Ontario government was uninclined to help Roch and his people, or if it's because they were afraid to apply for that help. After all, many of them were now in violation of their probation and might have been reticent to tell the government exactly where to find them. Either way, it made their lives significantly harder. Roch declared that the lack of help from the government was because the Ontario government were infidels who were trying to destroy God's chosen people. Now that they were persecuted, at least in Roch's mind, he said that they were within their rights to simply take anything that they needed from anyone who had it. All of the nearby towns quickly became victims of repeated thefts and shoplifting. As it turns out, when one finds an amazing deal on 200 acres of farmland, there's usually a reason for the low price. The soil on their land was too poor quality to grow much food. The Anthill Kids, with their farm failing and no longer receiving government assistance, became increasingly hungry, increasingly desperate. They started stealing fruit and crops from nearby farms with better soil, both to eat themselves and to sell them at their own roadside stall. They used the money from these thefts to finish outfitting their bakery. Then they started going door to door, selling fresh bread and baked goods in the surrounding communities. It was never enough money to fill their bellies, never enough to be comfortable. But nor was it so little that it would starve them out. Predictably, in this turmoil, Roch began to drink again. During a particularly hard winter in Ontario, one of the women under Roch's thumb made a fateful decision that she could not subject her infant child to Roch's abuse. She left her baby outside, in a metal wheelbarrow, in weather that was negative 10 degrees Celsius. It was outside for an hour and 15 minutes. The baby was blue and not breathing when it was found. They used a radio to call for an ambulance, but the infant was dead on arrival at the hospital. For some reason, the coroner reported that the baby died of SIDS, sudden infant death syndrome, rather than exposure, even though it was blue and frostbitten in the extreme. The infant's mother claimed that she did this as an act of mercy. The child had a very slight deformation on one eyelid, and that was enough to make Roch beat him. She knew it would only get worse as they got older, and she couldn't bear seeing the abuse. But because the coroner wrongly said that the cause was SIDS, no one was arrested. A determined social worker named Georgia Brown did continue to keep a closer eye on them from that point. She suspected what was going on at the compound and wanted to break up the cult and save the children there. She was remarkably determined and kept a close eye on every bit of news and every report on the cult. A year later, she got what she needed. A woman named Maurice wanted out of the Anthill kids. Roch told her that she could take her 2 youngest children and go. He wouldn't stop her. But she had to leave her oldest child behind, because Roch wanted her to be his next wife. She was 9 years old at the time. Maurice took 2 of her children and fled, and she told the social worker, Georgia Brown, the full and horrifying truth of what was really going on at the compound. She told them how Roch had taken to hitting everyone with the blunt side of an axe, including children. She told them how Roch had taken to performing surgeries on his people, with no proper tools and no anesthesia. He had also by this point separated the children into 2 social groups, the ones fathered by him and the ones fathered by others. His own children were treated as well as someone like Roch could manage, while the other group was used as little more than child slave labor. He used some of the children for sexual purposes, and he was keeping Maurice's 9-year-old daughter hostage to later be his wife. In 1985, the police again raided the Anthill kids' compound, this time with warrants to take the majority of them into custody. Roch did not resist. The mothers of the children washed and dressed them, and seemed almost pleased to have them taken away. There were so many children that social workers had to take pictures of all of them, just to keep track of who belonged to which parents. The children were all placed in foster homes, but their mothers were told they could have them back if they just agreed to leave the cult forever. Not a single one of them did. In these foster homes, the horrors of their old lives came into a tighter focus. Some of the children's teeth were black and yellow. One boy was deathly terrified of any man who had a beard, like Roch. One young girl would hold herself and rock back and forth, chanting. They told horror stories of sleep deprivation, strange rituals, chanting, and upside-down crosses. This might sound too extreme and too strange to be true, given Roch's background in religion, but multiple children in isolation from each other told the same stories and referenced the same things. And these stories were later confirmed by Maurice. A number of the children described sexual abuse from Roch, and the physical abuse was far beyond what even Georgia Brown had suspected. Roch had stepped on the head of one boy and told him, "The more you cry, the more I'll crush your head." He had thrown children against walls, against trees. He would sometimes hold 2 different babies up by their ankles over a fire and threaten to throw one in. Their mothers had to beg for the lives of their children and say why theirs should live and the other shouldn't. Now, this should have been an easy case to make and a quick shutdown of the cult, but an independent group was brought in to evaluate the situation, and they somehow determined that the children should be returned to the compound immediately. They claimed that though the lifestyle they lived there was unconventional, they were being discriminated against for being French in an English part of the country. Personally, I would have thought that it was the horrible child abuse that was turning people against them. Turns out it was just because they're French. Fortunately, in a rare moment of clarity, the judge assigned to the case was neither stupid nor blind to what was going on. They smartly and rightly disagreed with the independent assessor and ruled that the children would stay with the foster families and could now be formally adopted. However, because of the massive delay caused by the outside assessment and the time it took the judge to review and dismiss it, Roch had already fathered 4 more children. They were taken from their parents as soon as they were born. Despite all of this, the DA said that there wasn't enough evidence to press charges, and Roch was left in control of the compound and the people there. Thankfully, at least the children were gone. But that did Roch's mental state no favors. With his children taken from him, he became more violent, more unhinged. He would whip his followers with a belt and would break their bones with a hammer. He would even pull out their teeth. One cult member called Claude upset Roch, and Roch ordered him to tie a rubber band around his testicles. By morning, they had swollen to the size of oranges and turned blue and purple. Not long after that, one of his testicles became infected, so Roch had his followers hold Claude down while he cut the infected testicle off and cauterized the incision with a hot piece of iron. Somehow, Roch didn't think that this was enough punishment for having annoyed him, so he made the group vote on whether or not to stone Claude to death. The group voted against it. Roch was so incensed by this act of rebellion against what was clearly his will that he threatened to open Claude's belly with an acetylene torch. Claude, terrified, fled the compound and hid in the woods until Roch sobered up. In February of 1987, Roch stabbed Giselle in the leg and wouldn't allow her to seek medical treatment for the injury. She wrapped a towel around the wound instead. Predictably, it became infected and swelled up to the size of a football before Roch decided he could treat it himself. He attempted surgery by slicing the infection open and pouring boiling hot water into it. Again, without anesthesia. When the swelling had not reduced in a few weeks, he mixed salt and olive oil and rubbed that into the wound. Then he put spruce gum over it and covered it with a bandage. She limped around this way for a month, still having to get all of her chores done, including picking vegetables to avoid Roch's anger. When he left on a trip to Toronto, however, Giselle fled to a women's shelter. She was so brainwashed and conditioned by then that she did not know how to live outside of Roch's tyranny. She hurried back to the compound without ever having actually sought medical help, since she didn't want to have to explain to the police what had happened. Miraculously, once left alone by Roch, the wound did eventually heal. The violence continued to escalate, however. Roch used an acetylene torch on one woman's stomach on the day she gave birth to his child. Another man had his ribs broken with a club. One woman was kicked in the stomach when she was 3 months pregnant, causing her to lose the baby. And he broke Giselle's ribs as well, by kicking her with a steel-toed boot. He shot Nicole in the right shoulder. He bent all of Claude's toes back until they broke. He crushed Gabrielle's right hand in a vice and ordered Jacques to cut off her fingers with wire cutters. He also injected Gabrielle in the back with some unknown concoction and then broke the needle off inside of her and left it there. He fired a .22 caliber bullet at Claude, grazing his head. He beat their workhorse to death with chains. He punched a woman's face until her orbital bone broke. He ordered one woman to break Claude's legs with a sledgehammer, and he cut Claude's arm open with a piece of broken glass. I could go on. The list of abuses, of violence and horrors is nearly endless. The beginning of the end of the Anthill Kids came with a woman named Solange. She was complaining of stomach pains. Roch convinced himself it was a problem with her liver and that he needed to operate to save her. He took her to the bakery and performed the procedure there. First, he gave her an enema with a mixture of oil, water, and molasses. Then he started pushing and even punching her stomach. A tube was stuffed down her throat, the same tube that he had just used for the enema, and he started blowing air into her stomach. It's unclear why or what he thought this would accomplish, if he thought at all beyond the joy he took in torturing his people. Then finally, he cut her open and jammed his fingers into the wound and pulled something out. Some said it looked like a chunk of fat. Others said it was a piece of her intestine. Either way, he pulled the piece apart and stuck some of it back in the hole in her stomach. Then he had her sewn back up. He claimed she would now be fine. She died the next morning. Thus began Roch's final spiral. He was so distraught he told his followers he wanted to die. And he did try to end his own life. Sort of. Roch made several supposed suicide attempts, but he always chose methods, means, and times that were unlikely to work. More like cries for help than actual attempts. Had he wanted to actually finish things, there was no shortage of guns and blades around the compound. He simply chose not to use them. After the horrific surgery Roch had given her, the group built a coffin for Solange and buried her body. But Roch ordered her to be exhumed. He cut her open, removed some of her organs, and a rib. The rib he wore as a sort of talisman for the rest of his time with the Anthill Kids. He then ordered Jacques to drill a hole in Solange's skull, so that Roch could ejaculate on her brain, which he said would bring her back to life. I am sure I don't need to elaborate on why that didn't work. While this was going on, he started talking about extending his medical practice to giving several of his followers lobotomies. Thankfully, that never happened. But all of this together did create a situation that had Giselle and several other cult members questioning Roch's supposedly almighty and holy power. She started leaving the compound and even living with her parents part-time. Without Giselle there, Roch began to take his rage out on the other women in the cult, namely Gabrielle. After her last birth, she had a prolapsed uterus, which was causing her immense pain. But she was forced to still work in the fields picking cabbage. Tired of her complaints, Roch forced her to lie on a table, and he forcibly punched and pushed at her, trying to remedy the problem. When this failed, he used a cone-shaped piece of wood like a plug and secured it with a harness. The following day, she was ordered back to work in the fields. Terrified and in excruciating pain, she instead ran to the neighbor's house to plead for help. They did try to help her themselves, medically, but they didn't call an ambulance for her or take her to the hospital, and they didn't alert police. When she returned to the compound, Roch was so furious that he ripped out 8 of her teeth for, and I quote, having such a big mouth. Later, he attacked her with a knife and deeply sliced 2 of her fingers. She escaped again and again went to a woman's shelter. Over the course of 3 weeks, she received medical treatment for her hand and her teeth. When asked why she didn't leave Roch, she said that he was an alcoholic, yes, but she believed she could fix him. When she returned to the compound, Roch ripped off the cast that was on her hand and pulled out the wires that had been used to stabilize her fingers. Then he stabbed a knife through her hand and into the table beneath it, pinning her in place. With her stuck there, Roch pulled out another knife and began cutting off her arm, between the elbow and the shoulder. He finished the job with a meat cleaver. He then dipped the end of her arm into a saline solution before stitching it up. Despite having no anesthesia throughout this, Gabrielle remained awake the entire time. Even then, she says that she did not consider leaving Roch. Months later, Roch declared that Gabrielle's wound was not healing properly, so he used scissors to make cuts in the stump, and then cut a small chunk of flesh from her right breast, claiming that it would redirect the infection. If for some reason you as a listener have any lingering doubts about Roch's medical knowledge, or that he was really just a sadist with a medical fetish, his belief that the body can only have one infection at a time should clear that up for you. He then hit her on the head with the blunt end of an axe, leaving her with a large gash on her head. Terrified, she ran into the woods and slept on the ground for 2 days, hoping Roch would sober up. When she returned, however, he was still drunk. He then used a red-hot piece of drive shaft to cauterize the end of her stump. Miraculously, that was finally enough to snap Gabrielle out of her state, and she fled the compound and went to a hospital. She tried to claim that she had lost her arm in an accident, but the doctors knew she was lying and called the police. On August 19th, 1989, the authorities executed a search warrant for the compound, but found the property abandoned. Not a single soul was there. But they collected evidence, blood tissues, and a number of sharp tools with bloodstains on them. But why was no one there? Had they been tipped off by someone? Did that explain why all these years had passed without serious punishment? Did they have someone on the inside? No. It was actually a coincidence. The Anthill kids had simply left to Quebec on a bread delivery. When they did finally return, they could tell that their home had been searched, but Roch still refused to leave. Some other cult members did start to flee, however. On October 6th, Roch and the remaining cult members were arrested. After extensive searches of the compound and the grounds around it, Solange's remains were located. Roch was charged with her murder, on top of being charged for the mutilation of Gabrielle. The fact that he was still wearing one of Solange's ribs around his neck when he was arrested made for a difficult defense. Roch pleaded guilty to assault and to the mutilation of Gabrielle. He was sentenced to 12 years in prison. Others involved also pled guilty and were given lesser sentences. Roch pled not guilty to the murder of Solange, however. Eventually, the prosecutor realized there was not enough evidence to suggest that the murder was premeditated, and they made a deal with Roch for him to plead guilty to second-degree murder and be sentenced to life in prison in exchange for not being charged with any other crimes. No one else in the cult was charged with any culpability in the murder. Despite his 2 very, very lengthy prison terms, 3 women from the cult remained loyal to Roch, and each of them had more of his children after he was in prison. Over the years, it's estimated that Roch fathered 23 children, almost all of whom either died or ended up in foster care. On February 26, 2011, Roch was stabbed to death by Matthew MacDonald, his cellmate. Roch was apparently unable to stop bragging about the things that he did to his cult members, and his cellmate didn't want to hear the non-stop recitation of horrors. MacDonald pled guilty to the murder. But since he was already serving a life sentence, stacking a second one on top didn't really seem to faze him much. If anything remained of the Anthill kids, it died when Roch did. Thank you for listening. This has been A Troubled Past. The slow escalation of violence and indoctrination in cults is always shocking. No matter how many times I hear stories like these, there will always be a part of me that is shocked when the victims of a cult refuse to leave, when they believe the leader can be fixed or that the horrors they've undergone are their own fault. Sadly, once someone has been brainwashed into a specific way of thinking, it's often impossible to free them. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. If you'd like to hear more stories, please follow us on social media. And let me know if there are other topics you'd like to hear me cover in this way.